folks, I realised after my last book wrap-up that I hadn't read many books this year, and I said hadn't because I have since read quite a few because I went on a bit of a reading binge, which was great. So I'm here to share some of those, well, all of those with you today. Some great ones in here, so hopefully you get some useful recommendations. The first is Tangleweed Bryne. This is by Deirdre Sullivan and illustrated by Karen Vaughan. Now, I mean, the cover obviously is what drew me to this. It's absolutely stunning. The illustrations inside are lovely too. You've got Rumpelstiltskin. And what I like about this collection is that they're sort of feminist retellings of fairy tales. So there's an obvious influence from Angela Carter and obvious parallels to be drawn there, but she takes different sections of the fairy tale or does it from a different perspective, so you might not immediately know which fairy tale you're reading. And in fact, I got to the end of some of them and still wasn't entirely sure. There is an index or a contents page at the beginning that shows you or tells you which ones are what the retellings are, but the titles of the fairy tales themselves or of each story are more abstract, I guess. So this one is Consume or Be Consumed, and I think it's fairly obvious from the illustration what the story is. It's The Little Mermaid. You've got the sea witch there, absolutely stunning. I love these illustrations, but yeah, it's not entirely clear what it is when you start reading it. The illustrations are quite evocative of that, those sorts of illustrations from late 19th century fairy tales. So love that, especially the work of Aubrey Beardsley, who is one of my favourite illustrators. I just want to read you a little bit of the beginning of this one. This is from The Woodcutter's Bride. It says, "Outside in the forest there is deep snow. It brightens the earth and makes the place shine with a false cleanliness that I can hardly stand. I turn my face from the window and concentrate on feeling almost nothing. It has been a pale and honest morning, spent cleaning things and rearranging cushions, distracting myself with pretty, useless touches. Embroidered stars, some holly in a vase. The wooden floors are cold and getting colder. I do not want to light the fire yet. I do not want to waste the golden wood. It saddens me to think of it so old and strong that it turns to ash so easily. We all will, I suppose. My feet are numb, and so I pile the smallest twigs and twists of yellowed paper on the grate." So yeah, not entirely clear from that what fairy tale you're reading, but yeah, I like the different perspectives, and obviously the prose is very poetic and that continues throughout. So excellent collection of fairy tale retellings there, and you know, beautiful inspiration for illustration there as well. The next one is also a collection of I wouldn't say fairy tale retellings, they are fairy tales from the world of Ransom Riggs. So if you've read the Miss Peregrine's books, I didn't actually like that book, so I'm not quite sure why I picked this up. I think it's because it was so beautiful and I thought I'd give it a chance. I listened to the audiobook, which is narrated by Simon Callow, and that is fantastic. And I actually far prefer Ransom Riggs's short stories. I think he ties them up in a much neater, more satisfying way than at least the first Miss Peregrine's book did. I think that was my main concern with that book, is that at the end of it wasn't really satisfying to me, and it sort of made me question what the point of the rest of it was. But this felt like it was much more on point and yeah, made a lot of sense. Even if you haven't read the other ones, his other works, I think this stands on its own as a collection of short stories. And I just want to show you the inside of this because it is a stunning book. Look at the end pages, and then there's a book plate, ex libris page, and then we have this book here, and this is Silvana the Greening by Belinda Mellor, and this was a lovely sort of unexpected read. I'll read you the first bit of the back. It says, "Once heard, the song of a Silvana can never be forgotten. Yet for every man who wins such a wife, there are 3 destroyed in the attempt. So Silvana is kind of like a dryad, or is it a naiad? A spirit of a tree who can come to life or take a human form if they fall in love with a human, and they take on certain characteristics of both the human and the tree that they come from. So Fabium is our protagonist, and he goes into the woods on his 17th birthday, or the eve of his 17th birthday, and he wins a wife, a Silvana, and it's sort of about the politics between the humans and Silvana. Obviously there's a lot of environmental allegory there, because the trees and the woods are very important to their community, and the trees actually have a voice through the Silvana. So that was really interesting. There's a lot of political stuff going on. Yeah, a lot of political intrigue, but it's quite a quiet book. The prose is beautiful. It's very character driven. I loved the main character, Fabium. He's very sort of quiet and bookish. He reminded me a little bit of Newt Scamander, as in he's not your typical fantasy hero, which I loved. He's certainly not swashbuckling or anything like that. Even the sports that he's involved in, he's an archer, which is a less direct combat sport, I suppose. Yeah, so I think actually a lot of people would enjoy this. So it is fantasy, but it's a quiet sort of fantasy that I think people who like literary fiction will appreciate. If you like fantasy and literary fiction, you'll probably like this, but if you're just really into your fantasy, this might not be your cup of tea. But yeah, I think a lot of people who watch this channel and like the kind of books that I like would enjoy this. It's a little bit, I think it would have a crossover audience with The Name of the Wind to some extent, if you really enjoy the prose of that, although I don't want to make too direct a comparison between the two because they are very different, but I think the prose is what links them, and I think Name of the Wind is one of those books that people who like literary fiction and maybe aren't necessarily so into fantasy will enjoy, and yeah, this also fits into that category. Alright, so next up we have something completely different, and this is a celebration of Beatrix Potter. And this is a collection of art and letters from children's illustrators where they talk and pay homage to Beatrix Potter and yeah, the influence that she's had. It's a beautiful book, and it's split up into different sections. So the first section is Peter Rabbit, and then we go on to we've got Squirrel Nutkin, and my favourite, which is The Tale of Mrs. Tiggywinkle. So I'll show you that one. So for each one you've got a little bit about the book, a bit of background, and then there is a section of Beatrix Potter's original text and illustrations in colour, and then after that you get a collection of little letters. So this is a bit about how Beatrix Potter has influenced the illustrator's life and work, and then a picture, an illustration of the character or a scene, something imagined. So in this case you've got Beatrix Potter herself having tea with Mrs. Tiggywinkle, and this one here, which is more of a direct image from the book, Mrs. Tiggywinkle doing her ironing. And of course, and then you've got a lovely range of illustration styles in here and different imaginings. I'll show you a couple of the others. There's that one there. Tale of Mr. Todd at the end. I told you there were some goodies in here. All right, the rest are audiobooks, and these were all great as well. I think the lowest one, the lowest star rating that I gave from these was 3 stars. But this first one was a 5-star book, and I didn't know anything going into this book. And I don't want to give too much away, because that was the fun of it, was just diving in blind. I read it because Jen from Jen Campbell had started reading it, and she sent me a message saying, I think this is right up your alley, and she was right. Oh, I don't want to say much more. It's got elements of magical realism and historical fiction. Has got a mystery running through the middle of it, and I would recommend going into this not knowing what it's about, because I loved that experience. I felt very in the dark at the beginning, but her writing's so evocative, and it draws you in and makes you ask all these questions, and you sort of end up with more and more questions before you get any answers. I'm sorry if that's a very unsatisfactory way of describing a book, but I think it's masterfully done, and like I said, that's a great way of experiencing it. And the audiobook was wonderful, well narrated, well paced, all of that. So yeah, highly recommend, and this was, like I said, a 5-star read. And then I read Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. This was a non-fiction book. People have been saying this for a while, but a must-read, I think, for all people, especially white people. It is a series of essays looking at both contemporary Britain and race relations in Britain, and looking to the past and how race relations have got to the point where they are now, because I think British history tends to sort of skip over the fact of, you know, slavery being largely down to Britain. It tends to be more talked about in American history, I think, certainly from the way that I've experienced learning history. And I mean, we studied the civil rights movement in America, and that was from New Zealand, but never anything about the British side of things. So this highlights that. It goes into a lot of contemporary issues that are very much at the forefront of politics at the moment. Highly recommend this to anyone and everyone, really. Then I read or listened to Home Fire, which has obviously been out for a little while now. Was nominated for quite a few prizes, and yeah, this was another really hard-hitting book. It's about two sisters and their brother, who has, well, we know at the beginning that he's disappeared, and that he's sort of in contact with them but not really, and both the sisters have different views on him and whether or not they want to keep in contact with him. And then one of the sisters meets this man, and I, again, don't want to say too much more than that. But again, it's a fiction story this time. It has a lot to do with race relations and politics in the UK, particularly at the moment. Themes of race relations and terrorism. And the other interesting thing about this is that it's technically a retelling of Antigone, but you don't really get the Antigone side of it until quite late in the story, and then it got to a certain point and I went, ah, right, that's the Antigone bit, because I studied that at university. So yeah, I think I gave this one 4 stars. Very good. Again, well paced, very well narrated. Would recommend the audiobook. Then I listened to the audiobook of Sing Unburied Sing by Jessamine Ward, and I went into this with, I think, quite high expectations, because I'd heard really good things about it, which maybe set me up for failure. Often when I go into books with high expectations and they don't meet those high expectations, I feel disappointed. So that was the case with this one. It's very lyrical, the way it's written, and I liked the magical realism elements. It's got these ghosts that appear throughout the story, and that's kind of what ties the narrative together. But yeah, while I think the relationships between the different characters were intriguing, but the individual characters I found harder to connect with. Does that make sense? Yeah, I think it is a good book, but it just wasn't that enjoyable a read to me, partly because it is quite brutal in places as well. And yeah, I went in with probably too high expectations. But the next one I went into with probably no expectations, and I really enjoyed. So maybe there's something to that, I don't know. But it was Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng, and I hadn't read Celeste Ng's other book, but I do want to read it now, because I remember it being quite big on BookTube around about the time that I started on BookTube. And yeah, this was fantastic. A lot of themes of motherhood and community, and the theme of motherhood isn't one that I'm usually that interested in literature, but I thought it was really well handled here. It's certainly dealt with in lots of different ways, and yeah, all the themes sort of tied together very nicely and neatly. It's set in this small community that it's been designed, this town has been designed rather than it's compared to other cities or other towns that are just sort of happen to happen. Sorry, Lyra is making lots of noise. Come here, Lyra. But one of the main characters is a mother, and there are secrets that have been hidden, and Lyra, what are you doing? I think that the pacing of this book is excellent, and the way that she brings in extra little mysteries, and then she'll tie something up and then there'll be another thing and another thing. That's kind of how fiction works, in terms of making something a page turner. But yeah, I thought this was very well done, very well written and enjoyable. And the final book, and this one I absolutely loved, was The Map of Salt and Stars. And this one I had no expectations and pretty much no knowledge going into this. I went into it blind and I loved it. It is about a family, and our protagonist is the youngest daughter, and they're a Syrian family, but they had lived in America for quite some time, and so the youngest daughter, most of her memories are of America, so her sisters see her as more American than Syrian, and she sees her sisters as being more Syrian than American. So she has that perspective, so she's been used to a certain level of comfort as well. And so when her house is bombed and that they lose everything and become refugees, you see that stark contrast between life as it was and life as it is in the narrative. And what's beautiful about this is that it's tied together through story. So there's another story that's going through it. It's the story of Rawia, who is a heroine. I'm not sure if it's a traditional Syrian story, or if it was made up, but certainly it may be a retelling. I'm not sure. I probably need to look that up. But she is a young woman who dresses up as a man and goes off to make her fortune in order to help out her mother and her brother. She ends up going on all sorts of adventures, and so at the beginning of each chapter there's a section of Rawia's story, followed by the section about the family, and I think that worked really well as a narrative device, and it ties it all together nicely, and also their journeys parallel. So there are lots of times where in the main story, Radoir's story is referenced as well, because it's a story that the protagonist's father used to tell her and her sisters. So that's, yeah, beautifully done. And the other thing about the protagonist is that she has synesthesia, which means that she, when she sees things, when she smells things or hears things or sees certain things, she will see certain colours. So she will hear in colour and smell in colour. And that's something that's woven into the prose throughout, which I haven't seen done before, but it's very clever because you don't necessarily notice it unless you're looking for it. And it does turn out to be important to the plot as well. It's not just a prose device. So yeah, this is a fantastic read. It's been compared to books like The Kite Runner, and it's again a book that's very relevant to today with the refugee crisis, and obviously has been very timely in its publication, with the idea of, I guess, putting a face, even if it is a fictional face, to these families. And yeah, I think it's another book that a lot of people, maybe a lot of politicians, ought to read. But yeah, I highly recommend it. Just really enjoyed it. It's very brutal at times as well, but also very beautiful at times. Yeah, so those are the books that I've read in the past month, probably less than a month even. Yeah, a bit of a range in there, from Beatrix Potter to Syrian refugees, but yeah, most of them I would really recommend. And even Sing Unburied Sing, which I didn't enjoy so much, I think a lot of people would enjoy, and I know a lot of people have enjoyed it. It's a very good book, it just wasn't for me. Have you read any of these, and do you have any recommendations based on what I've talked about today? I would love to hear your thoughts on any of the things I've mentioned. If you want to find me elsewhere online, I am at Holly Dunn Design on Instagram and Twitter, and my website is hollydundesign.com, and there'll be some new things going up on there soon as well, if you're interested, including the cover of my picture book, which is, yes, happening very soon. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!